In this video, I'm going to talk about social science and talk about, in general, scientific principles and what we mean when we talk about science, and how we apply. Start to give you a sense of how we apply the principles of scientific inquiry to social and political phenomenon. In essence, what I want you to leave with this video is a better sense of what we mean when we talk about social science and what some of the advantages are of applying scientific methods to explaining social phenomena. And I think we have to start by recognizing that there's a lot of different ways that we can seek to understand the world or explain events that are happening around us, right? The humanities offer a lot of ways, a lot of insight into what it means to be human and where we find meaning in life. Artists, novelists, philosophers, the study of religion, all of these things provide insight. They offer different ways of knowing, different ways into these topics, and all of them give us important parts of what it means to be human, important ways that we can learn about our world and appreciate our world. And of course, each of these different ways of learning and knowing has their own set of rules and standards and expectations and norms. And when we talk about politics, we're talking about something that is universal to the human experience, right? As soon as a group of people first got together and started coming up with rules, probably not written down, but norms that were understood about who got their way and who didn't get their way, or how they shared power, or how they cooperated with one another. As soon as they did that, they were engaging in politics. And so the study of politics obviously predates social science. To this date, we can gain a lot of insight into politics from all kinds of different ways of learning about the world, including journalism, including even novels and film. But we're going to focus on one particular way of learning about politics, and that is the scientific way of learning about politics. So I really want to focus on that throughout the semester, and so we need to start by really trying to come to grips with what that is. One way to do it might be to think of a major event, right? So if we think of something like the 9/11 attacks, people have wrestled with that ever since, right? A number of movies have been made about it, movies about the attacks themselves, movies about terrorists, movies from the point of view of terrorists, movies from the point of view of victims. We've seen journalists write fantastic books and do amazing reporting on issues related to terrorism. We've seen musicians write works of classical music or pop music about it. All of these things indicate our attempts to understand this event, right? This huge event that has shaped our world over the past 17 years. Political scientists deal with this a little bit different. Political scientists aren't so much interested in the 9/11 attacks themselves. Historians might be interested in looking at that attack and tracing the causes of that one event. Political scientists generally aren't interested in the causes of a single event. We're more interested in trends and patterns. And so a lot of political scientists might be inspired to study issues related to the 9/11 attacks, but they're going to do it in a slightly different way. So rather than just ask, why did Al-Qaeda attack the United States? They're going to ask more general questions. Why do terrorist groups use violence? When is violence effective? Is it ever effective? How can nation states counter such attacks? When we start to think about the effects of these attacks and we start to think about how the United States responded to those attacks, You might start to ask, well, how do our attitudes get shaped by attacks like this? Do we have more resentment toward minority ethnic or religious groups as a result of attacks like this? Are our civil liberties threatened by such attacks? Any of these things would be fair game for political scientists, and political scientists have asked such questions. And in fact, this semester, we're going to be wrestling with big topics of the day. Why is it that liberal democracy around the world seems to be retrenching in some way or another? We see in the United States the Trump administration rejecting key aspects of the liberal democratic order from the last 70 years. Why do we notice party polarization across the Western world in recent years? We're going to ask big questions about the state of democracy right now. And we're not going to be interested in the Trump election per se. We're going to be interested in what that election might say more generally. Is it a sign of a more general pattern or not? And that focus on patterns and whether a particular event is meaningful or whether in fact it might be an outlier or a discrepancy in some way is really a key element of scientific thinking. So when we start to think about how we apply science to understanding the natural world, or rather understanding society in general, we need to first start thinking about, well, what does it mean when we apply scientific principles to understanding the natural world? And really, the most important way to consider science, I think, is as a process, right? It's a set of rules for how we investigate. It's a systematic way to think about problems. And what I really want to focus on that second bullet point is that it's a particular way that we ask questions and design research. It's really a particular way of thinking about the world. As we'll see in the next slide or two, it's a form of skepticism. It's a form of organized skepticism. We set out recognizing that we do not know the answer. We don't come to our question with an answer in mind. We think we might know the answer, but we're not sure. And so what we want to do is design research that will allow us to find an answer, and design research that will allow us to be confident in that answer. These rules help guide the way we investigate the world, and what we're really after is reducing our uncertainty. So we'll see in a lot of the things that we read this semester that what we're really trying to do in social science is not prove our hypothesis, but prove our hypothesis wrong. When we test a hypothesis, what we're actually doing is we're trying to disprove our hypothesis. And if we can't, if we throw everything at that hypothesis we can, and we can't disprove it, if we try again and again and again, and we still can't disprove it, then we start to think we might be right. That might be the way the world works. That hypothesis might be accurate. And so when we can think about science as a way of trying to reduce our uncertainty. We can never eliminate uncertainty in scientific investigation. Scientific investigation recognizes that our knowledge is never 100% rock solid, that it is always a little bit tentative, and what we can try to do is reduce that uncertainty as much as possible until we really have little choice but to conclude that a particular thing is going on in the world. So when we think about knowledge that we arrive at through science, what do we think of? Well, I want to go through each of these bullets carefully. First, scientific knowledge is positive, not normative. Now, you've probably heard the word normative before. Normative is about what ought to be. Positive is about what is. Sometimes people use the word empirical here, but we're going to use that word just a tiny bit differently in the next bullet point. But the idea of positivism rather than normative studies is the idea that we're answering questions about the way the world is, not about what ought to be. Now, I want to be really clear that questions about what ought to be are extremely important questions, okay? And our findings, based on positive research, often inform those normative debates. In fact, if they don't inform normative debates, I would argue that they might not be that useful. But we go into our research not knowing for sure what the answer is going to be, and we go into our research with the goal of accurately describing the state of the world. And only then, once we understand and are accurately explaining the state of the world, only then do we proceed to use that knowledge to inform our normative debates. Second, scientific knowledge is put to the test. It is empirically verified. We don't simply make a claim that the world works this way and leave it at that. We make that claim and then we go out and test it against observations made in the real world. We put that to the test. And as I said earlier, when we put it to the test, what we're actually trying to do is disprove our hypothesis, disprove what we think we know. And if it withstands such verification, if it lives up to such testing, only then do we draw a conclusion that we think we are accurately describing the world. Third, scientific knowledge is tentative. As much as possible, we describe how much uncertainty surrounds our conclusions. So today, we often use statistics to do this, and we can actually quantify our uncertainty. We can say, this is the margin of error that surrounds our prediction, or that surrounds our estimate of how much race mattered in Donald Trump's election, for example. Secondly, a second part of that is that if our tests don't hold up, then we reject our hypothesis and we look for a better answer to our questions. We are constantly putting forth hypothesized explanations about the way the world works, and we are willing to discard them if the evidence says they're not true. And that's really important. Because so often what we see in political debate is just the opposite. In political debate, we see time and time again people adjusting their attitudes and changing their points of view in order to comport with, or rather I should say, adjusting their view of the world in order to comport with their pre-existing conditions or attitudes, right? And so we're not going to do that in a scientific approach. Fourth, scientific knowledge is transmissible. All details about how we do our research and how we carry out our research is shared. We write it all up. You'll see this when you read the articles. Everything is described. We even make our data public as much as possible so that people can get our data and reanalyze it. This is actually a big topic of conversation in a lot of social sciences right now, including political science. Many political science journals are moving today toward a requirement that all data be made available to the public, no matter what. And even in cases of people who do field work, people who do more qualitative studies, anthropological kind of studies, increasingly those fields are looking for ways to make their field notes available and so that people can be sure and can go back and check for themselves to make sure we're arriving at the right conclusions based on what our data are telling us. Fifth, scientific knowledge is cumulative. No one study gives us the right answer. Knowledge accumulates over time with many tests and studies. And if again and again and again, if we test related hypotheses in different ways, using different data over different time periods, the more ways we subject hypotheses to the test, the more confident we are that that hypothesis is accurate description of reality, if again and again and again we fail to reject it. Sixth, scientific knowledge is general. As I said earlier, we're not interested in just explaining why Al-Qaeda attacked the United States. That's not a very interesting question to a political scientist. Much more interesting are more general questions. How do terrorist groups choose targets? Is terrorism effective? Under what conditions is terrorism effective? Right? Similarly, why Donald Trump won is a much less interesting question to political scientists than a more broad question that seeks to try to situate that event in a broader political phenomenon, right? So democratic norms, racial attitudes, immigration attitudes. We want to try to situate individual events within larger political phenomenon. We're looking for patterns, not one-offs. Finally, scientific knowledge is parsimonious. Whenever we have a preference, we're going to seek the simplest answer we can. The world is complex, and when we start to think of all the different factors that can influence public opinion or can influence the results of elections or something like that, we can easily get bogged down in extremely complex statistical models. Sometimes we have to do that, but wherever possible, we want simplicity. This is a key aspect of scientific knowledge. So when we think about how these characteristics of science get applied to understanding social science, I really do think that social science offers several benefits. First of all, as we talked about in the first part of the course, when we are talking about politics, especially today, we are extremely susceptible to particular individual biases. It is the human brain makes us want to fit events into our pre-existing beliefs about the world. If we want to really understand what's going on in the world, we have to figure out a way around that, or we have to figure out a way to hold those biases in check so we can figure out what's actually going on. And so, yes, there's a place for opinion. Obviously there's a place for argumentation. There's a place for rhetoric. But if what we care about is understanding what's happening in the world and understanding cause and effect so that we can perhaps change things, we've got to get outside of our own confirmation and disconfirmation and other biases. And careful research design using the tools of social science can help us do that, can help us search for systematic causes and explanations. We are also hoping to establish general knowledge about human behavior, not related to individual events or individual anecdotes, but generally. Ideally, we can find long historical patterns. We can find commonalities across the globe, across governing systems, across states, what have you. Transparency of methods is very important. By publishing and describing everything we do, when we do research and describing exactly how we measure things and where we get the data, in doing that, we are explaining the basis for our conclusions. We're allowing the reader to figure out whether the reader can trust the conclusions. We want to make falsifiable claims. In other words, we want to make claims that can be knocked down and that we're willing to reject if the evidence says we should reject them. And finally, social science recognizes that no knowledge is certain. That what researchers are doing when we're doing research is trying to reduce uncertainty, but there's always going to be some level of uncertainty there. We often hear the phrase, "this is a settled question." Well, there aren't actually a heck of a lot of settled questions in science. There are a lot of questions on which the evidence is overwhelmingly on one side, right? Something like climate change. Does that mean that there's zero possibility that the scientific consensus is wrong? No. It does mean that you're in pretty good shape if you assume that the overwhelming weight of evidence which is on one side is the correct state of the world. In most areas of research, though, we don't get that overwhelming evidence, right? That's relatively rare. Smoking causes cancer. Climate change is caused by human behavior. Those types of questions on which the evidence is, overwhelmingly stacked to one side are relatively rare. More often than that, we're going to get studies that are done differently and have different outcomes, and we're going to have to try to figure out for ourselves what the state of the world is. And as we're doing that, we have to be willing to divest ourselves of our own interest in the topic that we are researching. And when I say that, I don't mean that we don't care about that topic. We may care about that topic very much, but if we care about that topic, we have to be able to admit when we're wrong. We have to be able to admit, we have to be able to describe how certain we are in the results, and do so in a way that reflects the actual state of scientific knowledge in that area. With that, we'll sign off for this video, and we will continue these discussions in class about the social science and the benefits of social science.